Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the Microsoft MD-101 course. Today we're going to be covering Module 4, which is titled Explore Application Management. The main sections we'll be covering within this module is Implement Mobile Application Management, followed closely by Deploy and Update Applications, and then the third and the last section in this module will be Administer Applications. Well, there you have it, folks. That is the three main sections covered within this module. Like usual, I normally mention at this point in time in the video that this is not the only topics within this module. If you'd like to know a little bit more accurately of what's going to be covered within this module, you can get a little bit of a more detailed list in the video description down below with some nice convenient timestamps. Alright folks, in case you haven't done it already, please give the video a like. Like usual, I mentioned that this is going to give the video a bit of a boost. And if you'd like to know when Module 5 comes out, or if you'd like to know when I release other content, maybe also consider subscribing. Alright, let's move on to the first main section, which was Implement Mobile Application Management. Now, funny enough, the first topic within this section is actually called very much the same, and even the one after that. So the first topic is Mobile Application Management, which is usually known as MAM for short, M-A-M. Something you should probably be aware of regarding MAM is even though the name MAM, or the full name Mobile Application Management, is still used, it is now actually called App Protection Policies. Once you understand what this is all used for, you'll see the new name actually kind of makes more logic sense. At least for me it does. I don't know about you guys. Anywho, getting back to the topic, you're probably wondering what is this tool called MAM, or should I say App Protection Policies. Intune Mobile Application Management refers to the suite of Intune management features you can use to publish, push, configure, secure, monitor, and update mobile apps for your users. Yep. One of my favorite things about MAM is that MAM protects an organization's data within an application by using Microsoft Intune app protection policies. That can help you protect your company's data and obviously prevent data loss in doing so. This is especially useful these days with folks not always working from the office anymore, and even more so if you look at the fact that users, well, many of them, are using their own devices which do not necessarily have Windows installed. Some of them do, some of them don't. A lot of these folks and their devices are using Android, iOS, and, a lot of other operating systems. These are only some of the factors that make data security a bit of a concern. This is now obviously where app protection policies come into the picture. If you use MAM without enrollment, a work or even a school-related app that contains sensitive data can actually be managed on almost any device, including personal devices in bring your own device scenarios. I personally love the fact that we're able to prevent data loss or leakage, even though the devices might not actually belong to the company. This is really going to be a game changer for you guys in the sense of managing your users, their devices, and more especially their apps, and lastly, their data security. So how do we go about implementing this great newfound power? You implement MAM by creating app protection policies in Intune. You will have to go into the Intune platform, folks, and once you're there, you will need to set up app protection policies where you specify what it is you or your company wants or your client's company wants. Once you did that, you will need to apply it to a group in Intune. This can either be a user group, it can be a device group. All of that stuff was covered in the previous module. So if you're not sure what I'm talking about with regards to groups, make sure you've watched the previous modules, guys. Another term you folks probably would have heard of by now, and it's not to be confused with MAM, is the term called MDM. In case you don't know, or if you don't remember, MDM is short for Mobile Device Management, and this manages devices. So MAM was Mobile Application Management, so the A in the middle is application, And MDM is pretty much the same deal, except the little middle letter there, the D, stands for device. So it's application management and device management. So since we currently find ourselves in a situation where employees use mobile devices for both personal and work tasks, we want to make sure that they can be productive, but at the same time, we want to prevent data loss. It doesn't matter if it's on purpose or if it's accidental from user side. Either way, potato potato, we need to and we want to prevent data loss. It's still the same end goal if you think about it. We also want to protect company data that is accessed from devices that are not managed by us. To do this, we can use Intune app protection policies, independent of any mobile device management solution, MDM for short, in other words. This independence helps you protect your company's data with or without enrolling devices in a device management solution. By implementing app level policies, you can restrict access to company resources and keep data within purview of your IT department. Something you all need to be aware of is app protection policies are only supported by Android and iOS. In other words, Google's operating system and Apple's operating system. When you go ahead and enroll Windows devices with Intune, you can use Windows Information Protection, which offers pretty much the similar functionality if you think about it. In the end of the day, you will still be able to manage your devices and their apps. How you go about it might just vary ever so slightly, depending obviously on the operating system, but you'll be able to do the same thing. The important benefits of using app protection policies are things like protecting your company data at the app level, because mobile app management doesn't require device management. You can protect company data on both managed and unmanaged devices. The management is centered on the user identity, which removes the requirement for device management if you think about it. Another benefit is the end user productivity isn't affected, and policies don't apply when using app in personal context. The policies are applied only in work context, which gives us the ability to protect company data without touching personal data. There are other additional benefits to using MDM with app protection policies. Companies can use app protection policies with and without MDM at the same time. So, in other words, you can have some devices that are enrolled into Intune, some that are not enrolled into Intune. It's probably going to be a situation of some of them belong to the company and some of them don't belong to the company. And whether they belong to the company or not, whether they're enrolled or not, you can still go and apply app protection policies to them nonetheless. So, for example, imagine a situation where an employee has a device which is now issued by the company. This can maybe be something like a phone, and at the same time, they have their own personal device. This can be another phone, or it can be something like a tablet. The company phone, which obviously belongs to the company, is enrolled in MDM, in other words, Intune, and it is protected by app protection policies, while the personal device is protected by app protection policies only. So what's the difference? The one is enrolled, the other one's not. But either way, they are both protected by the app protection policies, people. So it doesn't really matter when it comes to protecting the applications. If you use MDM and if it's used correctly, it makes sure that the device is protected. You can enforce all kinds of security. This can be things like requiring a PIN to access the device. It can be things like forcing the user to use MFA, in other words, multi-factor authentication. Or it can be geographically to lock a device down. So in other words, a person has to be specifically in a certain location, geographically speaking, for him or her to be able to access certain company resources. Yep, you can actually do that, folks. The list is very, very long of some of the other things you can also go and do. Anywho, getting back to the main topic here, which was originally MAM, Intune MAM supports two configurations. The first one is Intune Mobile Device Management and Mobile Application Management combined. With this configuration, devices are obviously enrolled in your company Intune environment. The second configuration is mobile application management without enrollment. In this configuration, devices are obviously not enrolled like the name would suggest. Using this second configuration, devices are not managed because this is now obviously not enrolled in MDM. So for devices to be managed, remember they need to be enrolled into your company's Intune environment, the MDM. But they are, however, still managed via MAM, which means you can still manage applications. So using the second configuration, devices are not managed, only the applications are. So that still applies. If you want to manage the devices, you need to use the first configuration. If you don't care about managing the devices, well, then the second one will be just fine. The second configuration is typically used in a bring your own device scenario. If you don't know what that means, that's when users use their own personally owned devices for the purpose of work. In those situations, we don't normally enroll the devices into the company Intune environment since the devices don't actually belong to the company. With that being said, we don't have as much control. We're not saying there is no control, there is simply just a bit less control. All right, let's talk a bit about some of the considerations for mobile application management. You can see the title here is very much the same as the previous one. So the previous one was just called mobile application management. Now it's kind of the same deal. It's just considerations for the mobile application management. So, speaking of considerations, what are they? Well, first of all, folks, an app must actually be built to work with mobile application management, or should I say MAM. If it's not built to work with MAM, well, I think you can figure out what's going to happen. If you'd like to know more about which apps you can use, you can get an updated list of MAM-enabled apps from the Microsoft's website. Yeah. You'll see some of these apps support multi-identity and they will let you or the user use different accounts to access the same apps, while app protection policies apply only when the apps are used in the work context. All in all, these app protection policies protect organization data and prevent loss of sensitive and valuable data. App protection policies allow you to control what capabilities an app has when working with corporate-owned data. This includes preventing the user from copying data from a protected app to an app that is not protected by app protection policies. Apps configuration policies require the apps to support these policies. It might happen from time to time that your third-party apps do not support app configuration policies. If you find yourself in such a pickle of a situation, you can use the Intune App SDK to add support for app configuration policies to your line of business apps, something we'll talk about more in just a couple of moments. You also have the option of creating a configuration wrapper around an existing app. That brings us to our next topic, preparing line of business apps for app protection policies. Like we just mentioned a moment ago, some apps don't really support certain things. If you happen to find yourself in that sticky situation, you can use the Intune app wrapping tool for line of business apps that do not have built-in protection. This can be for simple apps, it can be for internal deployments, heck, it can be for quite a few things. I mean, just to give you an idea, some reasons you use the app wrapping tool would be if your app is deployed internally. It could be if you don't have access to app's source code. It could be if you didn't develop the app. It can be if your app has minimal user authentication experiences. It can then, of course, also be one of the ones I mentioned already earlier, like if your app doesn't have built-in data protection features or if the app is just, well, simple. A note I want to make for you guys, which is already on the screen, the app wrapping tool does not support apps in the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store. With that in mind, you can use the Intune App SDK for developed apps. That's the tool I spoke of just a couple of moments ago that I told you guys I'll get back to. So the Intune App SDK is designed mainly for customers who have apps in the Apple App Store or Google Play Store and who want to be able to manage the apps with Intune. However, any app can take advantage of integrating the SDK even your line of business apps. So in short, you can use the Intune app SDK for in-house developed apps. It can be complex. It can support Apple and Google Store apps like we've mentioned, and a lot more. Alrighty, let's move on to implementing mobile application management policies in Intune. So once again, folks, something you might already know by now because I've said it a couple of times in this module already. App protection policies can be applied to apps running on devices that may or may not be managed by Intune. So in other words, it doesn't matter if these devices are enrolled into the company environment or not. It doesn't matter if these devices belong to the company or the user. Either way, potato potato, in the end, the app protection policies can still be applied. We're not talking about devices here, we're talking about the apps. If we're talking about devices, then that would be the MDM we mentioned earlier, and that would actually require some of these devices to be enrolled. But since we're talking about applications, nope, doesn't matter if they're enrolled or not, doesn't matter if it belongs to the company or not, doesn't matter. Either way, you can go and apply these policies. Something worth mentioning, which some of you might have figured out earlier already due to something I listed, Intune app protection policies are assigned to users. Because Intune app protection policies are targeted to a user identity, the protection settings for a user typically apply to both enrolled and non-enrolled devices. Therefore, you can target an Intune app protection policy to either Intune enrolled or unenrolled iOS and Android devices. Something also mentioned earlier was Intune app protection policies can only be assigned to iOS and Android devices. If someone has a device like a Windows device, then you want to use something, for example, like the Windows Information Protection, which I mentioned earlier. And I mentioned to you guys earlier that it's very much the same as these app protection policies, except, well, it's for Windows. Alright folks, let's talk about managing mobile application management policies in Intune. When it comes to your app policies that you have applied, you can actually monitor app compliance status. Assuming you have privilege, you will be able to monitor and see which apps are not compliant with your policies. Nothing is private anymore these days, eh? The platform provides summary and detailed views of app protection. You can see exactly what's going on in your environment. So you can go and see whether these policies are actually applying successfully or not. And if there's any issues, any hiccups, yeah, you can see what they are. Some of the information includes things like, and keep in mind this is not limited to this, assigned users with app policies, things like apps with mobile application management policies, top protected apps, users experiencing issues, and also check-in status, something we did mention in the previous modules. You can run either user or app reports, and you can really pull a report on just about anything, guys. Really, the sky is the limit. Well, believe it or not, that finally brings us to the end of the first main section. For you guys, it might not have been that long, but for me, it really is. My mouth feels like a cotton ball from all that talking. So now moving on to the second main section in this module, which was deploy and update applications. All right, let's start things off in this section by talking about deploying applications using Intune. So before we jump into that, so for now we were talking about, the different kinds of apps we get, app types and all that. That's the stuff we were talking about just a couple of moments ago. And now we're going to be talking about the various ways we can go about actually deploying these applications and managing them. So the first one is to use Intune, or to make use of something called Intune. So the first thing I want to point out about this is when you deploy applications using Intune specifically, the whole life cycle of the app is actually very similar to that of your normal traditional desktop apps that you guys are so familiar with. That's the apps that we've always been using on our normal computers. So here's a picture for you guys, just so you can see more or less what I mean by that. So in Intune, the app lifecycle begins when an app is added. It then progresses through additional phases, like you can see, which are similar to that of a desktop app, and then eventually the app gets removed in the end of the day. Understanding these phases, you'll have the details you need to get started with app management in Intune. So looking at the picture once more, the first step, like I said a moment ago, is to do what? Add. You need to identify the apps you want to manage and assign. Once you did that, you can add them to Intune. Like we said earlier in this module, you can work with many different types of apps. The basic procedures are the same. With Intune, you can add apps written in-house, apps from the store, apps that are built in, and apps that are on the web. Looking at the picture again, the second step there is to do what? Deploy. After you've added the app in Intune, you can then assign it to users and devices that you manage. Intune makes this process actually very easy, and after the app is deployed, you can monitor the success or the failure of that deployment from Intune within the Endpoint Manager Admin Center. Unfortunately, some of the other tools we're going to talk about later in this module doesn't always allow you to monitor the success or the failure, but Intune does do that. So that's one of my things that I like about it. Additionally, in some app stores, such as the Apple and Windows app stores, you can also go and purchase app licenses in bulk for your company. Pretty convenient, wouldn't you say? What I like about this concept is Intune can then synchronize data with these stores so you can deploy and track license usage for these types of apps right from the Intune administration console. So you don't have to go to those app stores, you can track it from a console. Pretty nifty, pretty convenient. Now, step 3 in the picture is configure. As part of the app lifecycle, new versions of apps are regularly released. I mean, there's no control we've got over that, right? Intune provides tools to easily update apps that you have deployed to a newer version. Additionally, you can configure extra functionality for some of these apps. Looking at step 4 in the picture, which is protect, Intune gives you many ways to protect data in your apps. Some of those we actually have already mentioned earlier and to a certain degree discussed even. Those methods are things like conditional access, and it's things like app protection policies. I mean, for crying out loud, in the beginning of this module, we were talking non-stop about app protection policies. Their very last step in the picture is retire. I think this one kind of explains itself, wouldn't you say? So eventually, like you would expect, apps are going to basically reach their end of life. So eventually the apps that you've deployed will likely become outdated and they will probably need to be removed. The Intune platform actually makes it very easy for you to go and retire these apps from service. So if you ever need to do that, yeah, it's actually very easy to go and do that. Intune does it all for you. Anyway, let me remove this picture and make some room for talking about adding apps in Intune. Alright, so you can add the following app types in Intune, folks. There are actually quite a few. So the first type you can add is store apps. Now, me just saying store apps can mean more than one thing since we get different kinds of app stores. So which stores am I talking about? Well, folks, I'm talking about all the well-known app stores. That would be the Windows Store, the Android Store, which is called Play Store, and the iOS Store, which I believe is called the App Store, I think. I don't use Apple, so I'm not sure. I think it's called the App Store. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comment section down below. Other kinds of app types you can also add in Intune are Office 365 Suite apps, web links, built-in apps, line of business apps, and also, of course, good old-fashioned Windows apps. In other words, Win32 apps. As you can see, there are a lot of app types you can add, so they've really given us a lot of choice to choose from, guys, which is pretty cool. All right, moving on to our next topic here, folks. Manage or deploy Win32 apps with Intune. For those that don't know, these Win32 apps Microsoft is referring to are your traditional Windows apps that run on the device. They are also often called desktop apps. Now, getting back to the topic at hand here, if you find yourself needing to manage and deploy Win32 apps, there are some things you should be aware of. Some criteria that basically needs to be met. In order to deploy Win32 apps, there is some criteria that must be met, prerequisites in other words. Firstly, Devices must be joined to Azure AD and auto-enrolled. Secondly, there is a size limit per app that you want to go and add. Windows applications can actually be larger than 8 gig per application, unfortunately. There are also some good features worth noting here, mind you. This would be features like both 32-bit and 64-bit apps are supported. That's a win in my book. I don't know about you guys. Dependencies of other apps and install requirements can be defined as well. Alright, now that we've talked a bit about the old Win32 apps, let's talk about deploying applications with Configuration Manager. As you can see, we're kind of going through various ways of deploying various different kinds of apps at the moment, like I said earlier. So, with Configuration Manager, just to remind you folks, in case you forgot from the previous modules, or in case you haven't watched the previous modules, you need to actually drop the agent on the device in question, or sometimes we call it a client. So drop the agent, drop the client, install them on the device in question that you want to go and manage. And once you've done that, then you can go and manage that device and deploy all kinds of nonsense to that device, like these apps we're talking about, of course. All right, so with that being said, instead of using group policies, you can leverage the built-in functionality of the configuration manager to manage application deployment. This will provide you guys with way more flexibility and control for managing applications. Now, coming at this from a configuration manager perspective, application or app is a very widely used term in computing. In configuration manager, though, it means something different and specific. You can think of an application like a box. This box contains one or more sets of installation files for a software package. This is known as deployment type. The box also contains instructions on how to deploy the software. Now, when you deploy the application to devices, requirements decide which deployment type configuration manager installs on the device. You can do many more things with an application to cater to multiple scenarios. I'm going to list some key elements for you folks that make up the application. The first element is deployment type, something I just mentioned a couple of moments ago. The deployment type is a set of contents in the box. An application needs at least one deployment type as it determines how to install the app. The second element I'm listing for you guys is requirements, something I also mentioned just a couple of moments ago. Requirements ensure the target endpoint is installed with the most appropriate application. So if the target is, for example, running Windows 64-bit, the target is going to need a specific version or edition or something of this application, because maybe it might not run on it. Maybe the version that's going to be installed is for Android or Apple, or maybe it's for 64-bit or 32-bit or something else. So the fact that it's running 64-bit of Windows, the requirements will now ensure the target gets the appropriate application. Another element is global conditions. These global conditions can be used alongside requirements to predefine or specify custom requirements. For example, an environment key identifier for a test or production domain. We have the element simulated deployment. The simulated deployment evaluates the requirements, detection method, and dependencies for an application and reports out what the expected result would be without installing the application. This is really handy element if you ask me. Anyway, you also get deployment applications, or should I say deployment actions. Deployment action specifies whether you want to install or uninstall the application. Not all deployment types support the uninstall action, unfortunately. You get purpose. The deployment purpose specifies whether the deployment app is required or available. If deployment is required, the client will install based on the schedule. If deployment is available, it will be made available in Software Center. You then get revisions. When you make changes to an application, a revision is created to enable the application change configuration to be tracked. Then we have detection method. This is something nice we use to discover if a device already has an application installed. If detection method indicates the application is indeed installed, well, then configuration manager will simply not attempt to install it again. Next on the list is dependency. Dependencies define one or more deployment types from another application that the client must install before it installs this deployment type. This is very often very helpful in more complex application installations. And then, folks, the last element on this list, supersedence application groups. I hope I didn't butcher that name. You can use the configuration manager to upgrade or replace existing applications by using a supersedence relationship. When you supersede an application, you basically specify a new deployment type to replace the deployment type of the superseded application. Starting in version 1906, you can use application groups to deploy a group of applications to a user or a device collection. Previously, before, you would normally have to use something like a task sequence to perform such an action in a complex dependency setup. Now, no, you don't have to. Alrighty, now that we've talked a bit about deploying applications with Configuration Manager, let's talk a bit about deploying applications with group policy. So with regards to group policy deployment method, folks, there are some pretty big advantages with it, but at the same time, you'll find there are also some pretty big disadvantages with it. Whether you end up using this group policy method in the end of the day will probably depend on, I don't know, maybe the size of your company and your company's unique needs and requirements, because every company is obviously different, just like us humans. So in case you folks don't know already, Windows Server 2016 and later includes a feature called software installation and maintenance that Active Directory domain services, group policy, and Windows Installer service used to install, maintain, and remove software from your organization's computers. Alright, so what are some of these great benefits to using group policy for deployment, you might be wondering? Well, let me list some of the main ones. Group policy is part of ADDS, in other words, Active Directory Domain Services. As most of you already know, Active Directory Domain Services is a role you add on server which costs you, well, pretty much nothing. You just need to go and configure it. So basically, it's kind of free if you think about it. Since this is part of Active Directory, there is no need for a client agent. If you look at the other deployment tools like Intune, Configuration Manager, and so on and so forth, those either require you to do something like enroll a device into something like the company's Intune environment, if we're talking about Intune, or they maybe require you to go and drop or install some sort of agent on the device to manage it, if we're talking about something like Configuration Manager. Now, with group policy, you don't have to struggle with that kinds of nonsense. You just pretty much use it. On that note, it's easier to use and also relatively fast with deployment. This all sounds great, right? So what are the disadvantages then, you might be wondering now, since this all sounds too good to be true? Well, folks, unfortunately, when using group policy, it has minimal features. Little to none if you go and compare it to some of the other deployment tools that I've mentioned. Also, if you do decide to use group policy, it has no reporting of success or failure. What is meant by that is if you deploy something using this method, you'll have no cooking clue if your deployment was successful or if it failed miserably. Sucks, right? You're going to have no idea what's going on. You're basically doing it blindly if we have to go and explain it in a nutshell. All in all, guys, I'd say this is actually not a bad deployment method, but it's not suited for all companies. In my opinion, if you have to ask my opinion, not that mine matters, I personally think this is more suited for a smaller kind of company, a small to a medium, maybe more a small company, not the larger organizations. If you look at the larger enterprise organizations, medium to large, they're probably going to be using something like Configuration Manager, Intune, and other tools. Now, as for Windows Install Service, which was briefly mentioned earlier, this fully automates the software installation and configuration process. And it modifies or repairs an existing application installation. Anyway, let's move on to the topic of assigning and publishing. Right, folks, so the first thing I want to mention to you guys here is there's two deployment types that are available for delivering software to clients. Administrators can either install software for users or computers in advance by using the software, or give users the option to install the software when they require it by publishing the software in Active Directory domain services. Both user and computer configuration sections of a group policy object have a software settings section. You can add software to a group policy object by adding a new package to the software installation node and then specifying whether to assign or to publish it. You can also choose advanced deployment of a package. You can use this option to apply a customization file to a package for custom deployment. For example, you can use the Office customization tool to create a setup customization file to deploy Microsoft Office. Let's mention some of the differences between assigning application and publishing an application, since a lot of folks tend to get confused by these two. First of all, you can assign applications only to computers and not publish them. Also, software that has been assigned to a computer will be available to all the users who log into that computer, something a lot of folks are not aware of. Something I also want to mention is installation of an assigned program is not complete actually until the user actually launches it, guys. Oh, and folks, a user can install a published program through the program's applet in control panel, something you guys might have been able to guess. Now, moving on to a bit of a different topic, which I personally find very interesting, and yet not a lot of companies use it, at least not as many as you would expect. That would be the Microsoft Store for Business. So the first thing you folks need to know about this topic is you kind of get two kinds of Microsoft Store. The first one is the normal Microsoft Store, which is for general audience. This one Microsoft says you can find from Windows 10 onwards, but I disagree with that statement of theirs. If you go check on Windows 8.1, you'll find you can actually access it there. Now, folks, don't confuse Windows 8.1 with Windows 8. Those two are not the same. Assuming you are indeed running Windows 8.1, Windows 10, or Windows 11, you also usually have to run the correct edition of Windows to have access to this function from what I've noticed. Now, looking at the normal Windows Store, which the general public has access to, what do we find on there? Well, honestly, pretty much the same deal as what you would find on the Google's Play Store or the Apple App Store. You can find apps, games, music, movies, TV shows, and also books on there. There's probably a bunch of other things on there too, which I don't even know about. Now, as for the other version of Microsoft Store which we get, which is the actual topic here, believe it or not, that is Microsoft Store for Business. This is more for companies, however. What you'll find on there is more business related modern apps and line of business apps. That's not the only thing you'll find on there though, and also not the only thing you can use the Microsoft Store for Business for. We'll get to all of that in just a moment. I think let me first make some room here so I can list some of the things we can do in Microsoft Store for Business more clearly for you guys. Alrighty, now that we have some room, let's list some of the benefits of using the business version of Microsoft Store. The first benefit I'm going to list for you guys is that it's scalable, free, and familiar. You have to remember that none of this is running on your service, so technically scaling up is very quick and very easy since it's all running in the cloud and it's, well, kind of someone else's problem. Microsoft's problem in this case. You have your own dedicated private store section of the platform too. That is actually one of my personal favorite benefits about this whole thing. Unfortunately, to get that benefit, you need to meet some requirements slash prerequisites first, which is not mentioned on this list yet. We'll get to that in just a couple of moments. You get bulk app acquisition for company employees. You get the benefit of app distribution and integration with management tools. You get support for company line of business apps. A handy benefit is the one of app license tracking and management. Usually keeping track of licenses and companies is a mission of note, I don't know about you guys, but for me it was. Oh, and one last benefit I wanted to mention here is automatic updating of deployed apps. I mean, it is cloud after all, so it only makes sense for it to be able to do that for us. Now let's talk about the prerequisites for Microsoft Store for Business. Yes, folks, there are unfortunately prerequisites that will have to be met first before you can actually go and play with this nice toy. The first and probably the most obvious prerequisite is that you need to have internet connectivity. I know, it's obvious, but hey, it's mentioned by Microsoft, so don't shoot the messenger. I'm just a trainer delivering the course here. Don't shoot me. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, the Microsoft Store for Business is a cloud service. It's all running and happening somewhere else on Microsoft servers in this case. So with that in mind, for you to access it all and to make use of it, you need to have internet access. The second prerequisite is web browser for administration. Please note though, this is however not required for accessing the Microsoft Store for Business apps. The third prerequisite is that the Windows Update service must be running. I'm sure most of you IT guys already know why the service needs to be running, but just in case you don't know already, the service is for downloading and installing the updates. The fourth prerequisite is you and the users will need an Azure Active Directory account. Yes, guys, this is required to sign into the Microsoft Store for Business. If you don't have an Azure Active Directory account to sign in with, how will the store know that you are who you claim to be or that you are from the company that you claim to be? This becomes a bit of a problem in many ways because if you want to access your company's private section of the Microsoft Store, you won't be able to do that. Each company can have their own dedicated private section on the store where they can actually, believe it or not, go and upload and publish their own in-house developed apps. Only employees in your company can access this private dedicated section, but they will first need to prove that they are who they claim to be able to go and access that resources. And this is normally done using those Azure Active Directory accounts I just spoke of. The fifth prerequisite and the last one on this list of mine is Windows devices. So what do I mean by that? Your users who want to access the Windows Store for Business need to be running the Windows operating system, guys. It's kind of in the name. It's not accessible from other operating systems like, Android, Apple, and so on and so forth. You need to be running Windows. You also need to check if you're running the correct edition of Windows, mind you. Alrighty, let's talk about implementing Microsoft Store for Business. Firstly, folks, this is actually available for free to organizations, provided that your organization meets the prerequisites like having an Azure Active Directory account. You must also sign up for Microsoft Store for Business. I suppose you can call this a prerequisite of sorts, now that I think about it. What I mentioned earlier briefly already is that you can manage the Microsoft Store for Business in a web browser. You can access Microsoft Store for Business by using a Microsoft Store app or a web browser. And then lastly, folks, store permissions are delegated by assigning roles, much like most other things in Microsoft if you think about it. Well, folks, we have finally reached the end of the second main section of this module. It's killing me. We can now finally move on to the third and the last main section of this module, administering applications. The good news, folks, is this is luckily a very short section, so we're basically at the end of this module. So yeah, be hopeful. Anyway, getting to one of our last topics in this module, manage apps with Intune. To help with this, I think I've got a nice little arrow here for you guys. So you guys are going to see some of this stuff is going to sound familiar to some of the stuff we have discussed previously in this course. So first of all, is the app supported? So when it comes to managing or deploying your applications in Intune, very first thing you should probably ask yourself is this application that you plan on managing or deploying, is it actually supported by Intune? Because it might very well not be. If it turns out that it is, well, then you've got the green light. Now you need to go and create yourself a group. So in Intune, you can go and create yourself user groups, or you can go and create yourself device groups, something we did discuss in the previous modules in this course. Can't remember which one it was. I think it was module 1 or module 2 somewhere. But we did mention in Intune, we go and create groups, much like anything else, in many other Microsoft platforms, with the exception being the configuration manager / endpoint manager, because there I believe they call it collections. So the group, that is so that you can go and choose which group of users or devices you want to go and deploy this to, or which group of user devices you actually want to go and manage. Now that you've got your group set up, now you need to go and actually add the app to Intune. Once you've gone ahead and added the app to Intune, now you need to go and assign the app to one of those groups to Intune. Unfortunately, you can only assign it to one group in most cases. Once you've done that, you need to go and configure your policies, basically saying what's allowed and what's not, how you want this, how you want that. And then lastly, monitor your results to see whether the deployment or the managing was successful or basically whether it crashed and burned. Now I'm going to refer to one of the previous tools we spoke of in this module, which was, what was it? Group policy. So if you looked at group policies, which we discussed earlier, I think it was in the second main section somewhere. With group policies, you would remember if you deploy something via group policies, yes, it's very straightforward, very, very easy. But unfortunately, with group policies, you've got no cooking clue what the results is of that. You don't know if it's successful, whether you crashed and burned, you've got no idea. So you're basically flying blind. Now, if something like Intune and some of the other platforms, well, you've got a fairly good idea of what's going on because of all the reporting that you've got to your disposal. Anyway, folks, moving on to one of another last topics here in this module. Manage apps on non-enrolled devices. So we've been talking about managing devices quite a lot. If it comes to managing your devices, we've established that if we're talking about Intune, it's probably going to have to be a device that's enrolled, and you'll be managing that with your MDM, Mobile Device Management. And when it comes to the actual applications, it doesn't actually matter whether these devices are enrolled or not because of the app protection policies we spoke of. You would remember there was like a whole section about it. I think pretty much the whole beginning of this video was just all about app protection policies. And we made it very abundantly clear that these devices, when it comes to the applications, do not need to be enrolled. They could be, they could not be. It's your choice. And it's not limited to a certain operating system. This can be iOS from Apple. It can be Android from, what is Android for? For Google. Unfortunately, one of the downsides I believe we mentioned was if you want to go and manage these things with Windows devices, you're going to have to go and use that other tool, which is very similar to the app protection policies. Anyway, getting to the actual list that I want to give you guys. So very first of all here, a managed app is one that Intune controls. Does not mean that the device where the app is running is enrolled in Intune. It simply means the application in question is being managed by Intune. But it could very well be that this device is not actually enrolled into Intune. It could be a bring your own device scenario. So what does it give us? It gives us control over the distribution and management of these applications. Secondly, an unmanaged app, not a managed app, an unmanaged app is one that Intune obviously does not control. Basically, you can call this the exact opposite of what we just explained. So this installs directly from the public stores, in case you're wondering. Thirdly, you can assign apps to unenrolled Apple and Android devices. Yeah, these devices do not need to be enrolled, guys. Once again, we're talking about applications here. We're not managing the devices. We're simply talking about apps. When it comes to apps, you do not need to enroll these devices. It's very important you guys remember that if you're going to go into this exam. If anyone plans on sitting for this exam, they're going to check whether you guys understand that when it comes to managing your applications, devices do not, absolutely do not need to be enrolled into Intune. Make sure you remember that, guys. So users can use either the company portal app or they can go to the Intune company portal website at the following address if you want to go and do that. Right, folks, and then lastly, something we know already, you can obviously manage apps on unenrolled devices using app protection policies. Something I've mentioned so freaking many times in this module, it's not even funny. So whether these devices are enrolled or not, when it comes to managing the applications on these devices, you can use app protection policies. The only thing you need to remember about these app protection policies, and I'm not talking about whether the devices are enrolled or not, that is for the most part kind of sort of limited to iOS from Apple and Android from Google. So when it comes to Windows devices, there's something else you need to go and use. You're going to go and use the WIP we spoke of in the beginning of this module, of course. Anyway, let's move on to another one of the last topics in this section and in this module. That is deploy Microsoft 365 apps with Intune. So within this topic here, I think let's talk about deploying 365 apps directly from Intune. So the very first and probably the main thing you need to know about all of this when it comes to 365 apps being deployed via Intune. Intune actually, believe it or not, has the Microsoft 365 Pro Plus readily available. Yes, guys, that's right. It's readily available. You could just go and deploy it. Now, that might sound a bit confusing, but you have to remember here, Intune is Microsoft Intune. It's a Microsoft cloud platform. If you look at something like 365, what is that? It is Microsoft. It's another Microsoft cloud platform. So it only makes sense that Microsoft would go and incorporate their stuff into one another because it's all Microsoft at the end of the day. Both of them are cloud, both of them are Microsoft. So if you look at something like Intune, believe it or not, the 365 Pro Plus of 365 is actually readily available. You simply just need to go and deploy it and choose, well, who needs to get it and how you want to go about it. So with that in mind, Windows and Mac are both supported. I think it makes perfect sense that Windows would be supported. Can you imagine if this would not be supported on Windows? How funny that would be. So it's very obvious that Windows is supported, but Mac is also supported. You can use the Office 365 Suite app type if you want to go that route. There is no need to go and download any installation files. Remember, it's readily available, guys. And what is also pretty cool is the fact that 32-bit is also still supported. We obviously know 64-bit is going to be supported. I mean, let's face it, everybody and everything is using 64-bit these days. But I find it interesting that it still actually supports 32-bit, which is, well, pretty cool if you think about it. Alright folks, we've finally reached that point in the video. The very last topic is now up next. Last topic in the last section. That last topic is additional deployment tools that we can actually go and use to deploy your 365 apps. I'm going to list four for you guys. And those four tools are obviously all going to be Microsoft. I mean, let's face it, Microsoft wouldn't be caught dead mentioning something that is not Microsoft. So the very first tool I've got for you is Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager. So the Configuration Manager is usually a good choice for organizations that already use it. So if you're already using it, you know what? Why not keep using it? So this can be used to distribute and manage software. Configuration Manager scales for large environments, enables extensive control over installation, updates, and settings, and believe it or not, has built-in features for deploying and managing Office. The second tool I'm going to list for you guys here is Office Deployment Tool. This tool can be used to download and actually prepare the installation files. Now, doesn't that sound handy to you guys? So for organizations that don't have Configuration Manager, because we're not all that fortunate, not all of us have the money for that license, not all of us have the skills to go and use that tool, because obviously it takes time to learn these tools. For those of us, you can just go and use good old-fashioned Office Deployment Tool. So if you've got that tool and you don't have the Configuration Manager, but you still want to go and manage their deployment, the Office Deployment Tool can actually be used in those situations. You can use the ODT as a standalone tool, or you can use it to download installation files that can be deployed using Intune or a third-party software deployment tool. So yeah, you see what I did there? I said third party. I didn't say anything other than Microsoft because Microsoft doesn't like that very much. A third tool you guys can go make use of is the Office Customization tool. This is a web-based tool which we can go and use to configure Office 365 Pro Plus installations. With this new web-based tool, you can easily customize the deployment of 365 apps and other select to run managed Office products using a simple, intuitive, and a web-based interface. The tool is an Azure-based cloud service which allows you to create XML configuration files that are used with the Office deployment tool. In the past, you needed to go and create the configuration files in Notepad or another text editor. The Office customization tool makes this part of the deployment process easier and less likely to introduce any errors for you guys. And then the very last tool, guys, I don't know why Microsoft calls this a tool, because in my honest opinion, it's not really a tool. You can go and deploy the Office 365 apps by, well, using the 365 portal. Yep. So they just say the 365 portal or the Office 365 portal, but in reality, for the most part, this just refers to the user portal. So when the users log on to the normal 365 portal, depending on their privilege, depending on their license, they will or they will not at the top right hand side see a button that says install Office. If they do not see that button, it's usually a case of they don't have the right license. So that's the main thing Microsoft is referring to here when they say you can go and use the Office 365 portal. So if it's just one or two people, just a couple of people, sure, you know what, they can go and do that because it's not going to put too much strain on the WAN link. And you know what, then you don't have to go and use any fancy tools, any fancy configuration. But when it comes to a lot of people doing this at the same time, yeah, you might want to consider using some sort of deployment tool because you might be putting too much strain on the WAN link then, and you're going to have absolutely no control over the whole environment. Anyway, folks, that was the very last bullet point in the last topic, in the last section, and that brings us to the end of this module. So I hope you guys have enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something. If you have, please do me a favor and give the video a like. And obviously, like I've said in the past, if you would like to know when Module 5 comes out or any other nonsense on this channel, remember to obviously also subscribe. Before you guys disappear on me, just the usual special thank you to the Patreon and PayPal sponsors, the guys that support this channel. And let's not forget those of you that clicked on the thanks button below the video. And then, of course, also those of you that just like to buy me a cup of coffee or a milkshake. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, if you buy me a milkshake, I'm not gonna buy it for myself. I'm gonna end up giving it to my kids. But still, on behalf of my kids, I'm gonna say thank you for that. And yeah, here is the list of all of those of you that has sponsored. So thank you very much, guys. See you on Module 5.